3 Lives 3 Worlds. The Pillow Book. Lower volume. Original work by Tangqi Gongzi. English translation, Hamster 428. English editing, Rockharlequin, Lily, JoannaKuang. Part 3 Arania. Chapter 2. Fengju didn't know for how long she had slept. Although she was always feeling hazy and didn't know anything that was going on, occasionally she could feel something. She was being hugged by someone. She felt she knew the person who was hugging her, but for some reason she could not think of his name. She could smell the wafting scent of white sandalwood in the air. It was a familiar scent. But this sort of familiarity was somehow very distant, and it made her skeptical. After being held for a long time, she seemed to fall into a soft surface. Feeling more comfortable, she relaxed into the arms that were holding her. Because she wasn't fully conscious and her body was in excruciating pain most of the time, she felt extremely tired. Lying like this was to her liking. It was comfortable. Yet pain was a persistent visitor. She wasn't very good at enduring pain. She could guess that she had made a sound or two whenever she couldn't bear it. Each time a bout of horrid pain passed over her, there was always an arm holding her close, feeding her one spoon after another of some kind of liquid. The strong smell was blood-like. It did not taste pleasant at all. But each time it reached her throat, her pain subsided greatly. She deemed it must be good stuff. When she choked, someone slowly patted her back. When she became anxious, someone held her hand. When she whimpered, he hugged her close in his arms. So she kept whimpering, even if nothing was the matter. She whimpered whenever she remembered to. By the time her mind began to regain cognition, she tried to determine the identity of the person tending to her. His care had been tender, and she felt he was quite experienced. But the more she tried to think, the more her mind clouded up. Time flowed like water in a stream, soundlessly on and on. In her muddled state of mind, her eyes foggily passed over many familiar faces. At last they stopped on a matron who dressed and moved ever so elegantly. She was her mother's mother, her maternal grandmother, the elderly Lady Fumi. Her head started to ache. At this point, grandmother was sitting in her family's guest hall speaking to mother about something. Although Lady Fumi seemed friendly enough, she was actually a very terrifying elderly fairy. Her goal in life was to marry off all of her daughters to great men. With her careful calculations, all 7 daughters indeed found great matches. She was undoubtedly the backbone of the family. But after marrying all of her daughters away, she began to feel the lonely emptiness in life. She felt empty for 2,000 years until Fengju's father brought the family back to visit on her grandfather's birthday one day. Her father brought her to present tea to her grandmother. Her elderly grandmother, who was at the depth of her bleak winter days, was delighted to discover that her oldest granddaughter Fengju was now over 30,000 years old. It was the ripe age to begin finding for her a husband. Her elderly grandmother had found a new pursuit in life, and from that day on she graced her eldest daughter's home as a regular guest. Fengju hid outside the small garden and tried her best to listen in on what her grandmother was telling her mother. She heard grandmother say, "The reason why I am planning Juer's marriage this early is so that she may make a good choice. With Juer's looks and character, she must be married into an established family. However, not everyone from an established Family is capable. For example, last time your second brother-in-law recommended the South Sea water god's younger son. He does have good looks and a prestigious background, but he holds no real title. It was such a pity. I think that for a man to be worthy of Juer, he should have some power in addition to a distinguished background, only then does he have potential. What's more, I'm not too fond of generals. Take your fourth brother-in-law for example. He may hold a high position, but her marriage had always made me ill with worry. If she didn't starve herself pining for him back then, I wouldn't have handed such a good child to a brute. What's so good about a general? Fighting and killing all the time, never knowing how to be gentle and kind. As Juer's mother, you mustn't make the same mistake as I did. If there is a warrior befriending Juer, you need to take caution. There is additionally another important matter. It must be a compatible match. Look at how beautiful our Juer is, we must find her someone just as handsome, so that I will have beautiful great-grandchildren. Else we'll ruin the reputation of the red foxes along with the nine-tailed white foxes. I've only thought of this much so far, let me go back and think some more on the details. Her mother praised her grandmother for having thought so thoroughly. Now they were surely going to find Fengju a good marriage according to her grandmother's wishes. She hoped she wouldn't be too worried, so on and so forth. After hearing their conversation, Fengju's heart was weighed down in tons. She left the small garden uneven steps. Along the way, her head felt as black and heavy as a mountain. Although Donghua Daijun, whom she liked, built his legacy from 2 empty hands and had a high status, he did not come from an old established family. Her grandmother would surely be displeased with this. Although Daijun had held some power in the past, he had since retired to Taichan Palace and no longer held real power these days. Grandmother would dislike that even more. His prowess on the battlefields were recorded in history annals for future generations to revere. He was infinitely better compared to her fourth uncle-in-law. Grandmother would dislike that worst of all. Besides Daijun's good looks, there wasn't a thing her grandmother would like about him. What was she to do? Yellow leaves floated outside the veranda, the wind in autumn, the trees in autumn, everything about the season is full of sorrow. Her heart sank woefully. She squatted on the veranda in thought. It probably wouldn't work if she asked her father to send someone to Taichan Palace for matchmaking. She could only depend on herself in pursuing Donghua Daijun. At this moment, another scene appeared. Not once did Fengju feel this was a dream she had dreamt up. Rather, changing scenes felt very normal to her. But she could vaguely sense it was something that had already happened in the distant past. However, she almost forgot that this was the reason she had asked Siming to bring her into Taichan Palace that year. If it wasn't for the fact that Donghua didn't fit into her family's criteria, if she had told her family of her feelings and asked her father to send someone to Taichan Palace for matchmaking, then how would their story be like today? When the word today crossed her mind, she suddenly felt strange. Today, today. She felt she wasn't too happy with today. But what happened today? What day was today, exactly? She confusedly looked around. She was on a wedding bed, wearing a red bridal gown. Flickering wedding candles, dim moonlight, endless insect chirping. Oh, today was her wedding day with Kang Yi Shenjun. Her father searched high and low, and finally chose Kang Yi Shenjun of Mount Xiu to be her husband. She remembered that of course she hadn't been happy with the groom her father had chosen for her. Before getting onto the bridal palanquin at their front door, she was still contesting with father that if he had liked Kang Yi so much, he should get on the palanquin himself, there was no need to marry her to him. What she said angered her father so much he immediately tied her up with magical ropes and tossed her into the palanquin. But in only a second she was somehow on Kang Yi's wedding bed. She vaguely felt something interesting had happened on the way from King Kaihu to Mount Xiu, but how come it was as though the middle part was cut out? For the first time, she sensed she was inside a dream. But everything felt so real that she couldn't be sure. In the flickering candlelight, she suddenly heard the voice of a child attendant announcing from outside, "Shenjun has arrived." It was the wedding night and consummation hour was nearing. This Shenjun they announced must be Kang Yi. Fengju gave a start. She couldn't even remember she had gone through nuptial rites with Kang Yi, but now they were consummating. In fright, she started to panic. She took off the golden hairpin from her hair, closed her eyes on reflex, and feigned sleep. She thought to herself that the hairpin was sharp. If Kang Yi stepped anywhere near her, she would let his red blood dye the wedding bed tonight. Fengju for a second felt confused. In her memory, why was it that this didn't really happen the night she came to Xiu Palace? Why did she remember that before they performed nuptial rites, she had already destroyed his palace? Or, maybe, perhaps, was she only dreaming? She calmed down a little. Whether this was a dream or not, since she didn't like this Kang Yi Shenjun to begin with, and having high integrity herself, she wouldn't let him take one bit of advantage even in a dream. When she sensed Shenjun had neared her, she slightly opened her eyes, her hand poised with the hairpin waiting to protect its owner's chastity. But it had only left her hand when, cling, it fell back into the piles of bed covers. Fengju stared incredulously at the person nearing her. She blinked in befuddlement. The one coming toward her wasn't Kang Yi, but the person mentioned previously, Donghua Daijun. Under the moonlight, his silver hair was as white as snow, his purple robe glowed with his movements, and the face emerging was the one Xiaoyan dubbed Ice Face. The person standing next to the bed was the very king himself. When Daijun saw her open her eyes, he was rendered stupefied for a moment, then he touched her forehead. After he was done checking, he did not withdraw his hand. He looked at her for a long while before asking her, "Are you awake? Do you feel uncomfortable anywhere?" Fengju wordlessly stared at Daijun, stupidly pondered for a while, and then at length lifted her hand to beckon him near. Daijun understood her gesture and came to sit on the edge of the bed, his body slightly bent close to her. From this distance her hand could reach his robe collar, but her goal wasn't Daijun's collar. Just a moment ago, her entire body was still limp without strength. Just getting herself propped upright was already difficult to do, but at this height, things was a lot easier. Daijun carefully studied her, his silver strands falling onto her shoulders. He asked her in a low voice, "Are you uncomfortable? Where do you feel discomfort?" She didn't feel any discomfort. While Daijun asked that question, she had quickly reached her hands out and used all of her strength to pull down on his robe collar, then she latched her rosy lips precisely onto Daijun's. The series of actions, pulling, tugging, dragging, kissing, shocked Daijun into a stunned state. Fengju clasped her hands around Donghua's neck, her lips firmly attaching his. She thought to herself that just a moment ago, she was suspicious this was a dream. The next moment Kang Yi Shenjun had changed to Donghua. This proved it was indeed a dream. It kept morphing because it was trying to fulfill an unfinished dream. That year when she left Zhukongtian, the only regret she had was that she had entrusted her love to the wrong person and never got anything back. It was a disgrace to King Kaiyu. Since they got to see each other again in a dream, and dreams could change any minute, what would she do if Donghua vanished from her in the next second? She must seize this moment to kiss him. Such opportunity doesn't come knocking twice. It wasn't bad if she could repay back even if only inside her dream. Donghua's lips were as icy cold as she had imagined them to be. They were motionless even as she was tightly pressing onto them, as if he was curiously waiting to see what she would be doing next. Fengju felt satisfied with this display. She was taking advantage of him. He should sit there like a statue. It'd be better if afterwards his face reddened from the embarrassment of being taken advantage of. After adhering their lips for long enough, she awkwardly nudged her tongue out to taste his upper lip and could feel that Daijun was trembling a bit. This reaction was in line with her calculation. The taste of satisfaction spread through her like watching a tree vine quietly climbing to the top, or hearing a drop of dew rolling down lotus leaves. She released him after a couple of licks, feeling it wasn't too bad that she had taken advantage of him to this point. And anyhow, she wasn't too experienced, she didn't really know how else to take further advantage of him. Daijun's eyes were slightly clouded, his expression quiet. It seemed even if the Tai mountain collapsed around them, an imaginary Daijun was still as unruffled as the real Daijun. Fengju was a little disappointed that Daijun wasn't embarrassed. But that was fine, he had always been thick-skinned anyway. Fengju's hands that were clinging onto Daijun's neck moved up to softly touch his face. Finally content, she moved back to lie down on the pillow when she was held back by a strong force. She hadn't realized what was happening when Daijun had already loomed closer to her face. The indigo jewel on his forehead was emitting an illumination as bright as the morning star, reflecting plainly her dumbfounded face. He was only an inch away from her nose. Daijun looked at her a while, then ever so naturally bent down and gently grazed over her lips with his icy ones. Fengju dazedly heard a string snap inside her head. He studied her with deep, dark eyes. Seeing her lashes flutter, he unhurriedly deepened the force, coaxed open her lips, easily found her tongue, and guided her to clumsily return his kiss. Daijun kept his eyes open all this while to observe her reaction. In reality, besides widening her eyes at him, Fengju didn't have any other reaction. Her mind had turned to mush by this kiss. This glob of mush faintly though to herself, compared to the fluttering kiss she initiated, his kiss was so brutal in comparison. Daijun was definitely a god who never wanted to lose. He was on an entirely other level to pay back even one teeny-tiny offense. She held her breath for too long and could not breathe any more. She wanted to push Daijun away but her hands had turned into powerless jelly. Her mind was so scrambled today that she could not think to change back to her original form to escape the situation. Daijun slightly loosened his hold, his lips were still connected to hers. "Why are you holding your breath?" he asked in a relaxed manner. "Must I also teach you how to breathe on these occasions?" Yet there was a hint of hoarseness in his voice. Being the queen of King Kaiyu, there was one thing Fengju always adhered to, and that was to keep King Kaiyu's face at all time. No matter what happened, she must never have King Kaiyu's name soiled. What Dong Hua said really hurt her pride. She suddenly regained her spirit and used sophistry to respond. This is how King Kaiyu people react in such times. I don't need an ignorant person like you to criticize me. When things like this happened, what exactly was her King Kaiyu's customs? She was only 30,000 years old, she was but a cub. Of course she never had the chance to witness nor really understood them. She found out today for the first time that not only lips were used in kissing, but that tongues could also be used. She had always thought kissing only involved touching lips and nothing else, and that the more love there was, the longer they must stay attached. For example, she had pressed her lips onto Daijun's for so long, her love must have reached the depth of the sea. It turned out there were many gray areas in between that she did not know, there was so much more she needed to learn. However, if even she, as a native of King Kaiyu, didn't know about this custom, how would Daijun know any better? She thought it'd be a good idea to deceive Daijun with this excuse. Hearing no response from Daijun, she added, "Weren't you breathing just now?" Her expression turned solemn. This is a taboo in King Kaiyu. Grey Wolf Diddy, who lives next door to us, lost his fiancée because of this. People look down on things like this. After hearing her, Dong Hua indeed seemed to be in thought. She praised herself for fabricating this nonsense so well. Well done, Xiao Feng. But Xiao Feng had accidentally forgotten one thing. Sometimes, Daijun was a deity with an immense sense of curiosity. Sure enough, Daijun's curiosity led him to think a while before he offered this conclusion: how interesting this custom is. Since I haven't tried it yet, it's not a bad idea to try your King Kaiyu's custom now. Before she could think of anything, Fengju pushed Daijun's chest and blushed pink as a peach blossom. How can you utter such a shameless thing? In truth, Daijun was just joking, but he didn't know his listener would not think of them as casual words. He reminded her, "Who started it, do you remember?" Fengju's raging fire instantly flamed out. This was a question of pride. She thought for a long time before she was emboldened enough to reply, "I admit it was I who started it." She rubbed her nose and began to defend herself with sophistry, "But this is my dream, so I could do whatever I want." Here, she suddenly realized. Yes, this was her dream. Dong Hua was created from her imagination. Usually, she never won against him in an argument. How could he still be so arrogant even in her dream? He was really disregarding the dream's owner. She looked at Dong Hua fearlessly with newfound bravado. You are merely created from my imagination. In my own dream, I can take advantage of you all I want to, however I want to. But you can't do the same to me." She barreled on now that her mind was clearing. "You don't have to counter what I said with reason, because there are no reasons in this dream. My words are the only reason." Her speech was said with conviction. When she finished, she herself was a little awed. She quietly watched Daijun. Daijun was rendered blank for a long while. She wondered if Daijun might have been intimidated. She waved her hand in front of him. Daijun grabbed onto her waving hand. He was clearly looking at her, but his words seemed directed at himself. so she thought she was dreaming. A pause. I was wondering why you suddenly became so relaxed, and you're not even angry. Fengju heard each word from Daijun's 2 sentences clearly, but she didn't quite understand his meaning. What are you talking about, dreaming? Utterly lost, she went on, isn't this a dream? If it's not a dream, then where did you come from? So very confused now, she added, why should I be angry at you? She gave a start when her eyes took a glimpse of his red lips. Her face blanched as she said, did I really take advantage of? She couldn't say the word you. Her free hand, which wasn't held by Dong Hua, began to quietly pull up the quilt in front of her chest in an attempt to cover up her head as well. Reality was a bit cruel. Daijun caught a corner of the quilt mid-air. Her hand was held back in his. He focused his gaze on her for a long while, then at last asked, do you remember what you did before you fell asleep, Xiao Bai? What was she doing before she fell asleep? Fengju found she had absolutely no impression. Her brain was thrown to the wind. A fogginess of forgotten memories about a tragic past was carried away by the light breeze. Suddenly, half of her heart went cold. Did this symptom mean she had lost her memory? Sorrow gave birth to coldness. When this thought came to her, Fengju's limbs stiffened cold. At this very moment, her freezing hand was being held even tighter, and next to her ear was Daijun's serene voice, I'm here, don't be afraid. You're just drowsy from your sleep, that's all. She looked to Daijun uncertainly. Daijun smoothed the plastered strands on her forehead and then composedly said, we sometimes can become this way after sleeping for too long. It's all right if we can't remember the things before we fell asleep. You still remember the most recent things, so there's nothing to worry about. A soft flash appeared in his eyes. Truthfully, I don't think it matters if you can't remember certain things. Although Daijun's words couldn't be counted as comforting consolation, when she heard them, she actually felt greatly assured. Only now could Fengju see clearly. Although she was not dreaming, she was indeed lying on a spacious bed. But it wasn't a wedding bed with red beddings and draperies. Under her body was a mattress, before her eyes was draping gossamer, all in the same deep indigo color. Beyond the curtain wasn't a pair of burning dragon phoenix candles, used for wedding night. Rather, floating above the bed canopy was a night pearl as large as a goose egg. Through the thin gossamer curtain, the sky appeared to be a large screen while the ground was like a long carpet. The white forest and its glowing light gave off a mystical atmosphere all around. Of course, the spot radiating the strongest mystical energy came from Daijun, who was sitting in front of her. Daijun said the most recent things. The most recent things, Fengju thought for a moment, recalled something, and whispered to Dong Hua, if you're not a dream, then, my wedding with Kang Yi Shenjun before you appeared, must have been the dream. She wondered about the origin of this dream. With a confused face she said, 2 months ago my old man, my father forced me to marry Kang Yi Shenjun of Mount Xiu. On the wedding night, I did all I could to wreck Kang I's palace. This marriage went down the drain. I heard the reparation of the palace cost him a fortune that year. But Kang Yi Shenjun didn't mind that I had turned it into rubble. He even spoke on my behalf when my father wanted to reprimand me. She concluded in a lowered voice, he had made this gesture, but I had thought since his sovereignty on earth was too expansive, he already had many troubles to worry about and his mind already too exhausted. But then he spoke on my behalf. I was grateful to him, and feel somewhat guilty about destroying his palace. I'm a bit ashamed. I reckon this is why I dreamt such a bizarre dream today. Fengju's hair became tangled during her nap. Wordlessly, Daijun helped her smooth it out. He thought about her incoherent summary. Siming said her forced marriage to Mount Xiu happened 70 years ago, but Fengju insisted it had only been 2 months. It seemed when she was seriously injured, she did not have enough fairy energy and her memory had been slightly muddled by Aranya's dream. Her memory had stopped at 70 years ago. This was why she did not question in anger why he had given the Saha fruit to Jihan. Daijun felt that the ability to addle one's memory inside the Aranya dream was quite a blessing. Fengju pondered for a while. In the end, there were a couple of things that were still puzzling to her. Doubt surfaced her face as she nervously said, "Actually, I had felt something wasn't right the moment I opened my eyes." She looked at Daijun as distress started to surface in her eyes. "If I was dreaming back then, and now I'm not dreaming anymore, then where is this place, Your Majesty? Why are you here? And whose bed is this?" Daijun looked at her for a moment. It seemed at this time Xiao Bai's memory only included the times she spent on Zhukongtian as his baby fox. This was going to be much easier. With a sincere expression, he started his hogwash. "This is a force field like the wicked lotus sphere. Yan Chaiwu trapped me in here. You worry for me so much that you hurried here to save me." Fengju's mouth widened into the shape of a salted egg, one could fit an entire fist into it. "Is Yan Chaiwu that incredible? He could trap you twice." Daijun retained his composed look. "Not only did he trap me, he trapped you too. That's why we can't leave this place, we are stuck in here. That villain Yan Chaiwu!" Fengju indignantly exclaimed. But she next became puzzled. "Why is it that Yan Chaiwu had trapped you again and I had rushed here to save you, but I don't remember any of it?" "Because you've been sleeping for too long," Daijun calmly replied. Seeing that there was still doubt in her eyes, he caressed her face, determinedly. Looked into her eyes, and lowered his voice, "Xiao Bai, haven't you always saved me when I was trapped? Haven't you always saved me when I was trapped?" Fengju stiffened. Tonight her mind was indeed upside down. She was acting in strange ways that she could not explain. But Dong Hua's words were like delicate snowflakes landing on her lashes, sweeping past the clouds in her mind. She felt somewhat more sober. Memories of Zhukongtian came flooding back, her heart was suddenly aggrieved. She remembered there was one day when she conversed with her aunt on how mystical the world could be. It was mystical because there were numerous things that seemed similar but were not. For example, love and desire. There was little difference between the two at first glance, but they are in fact quite different. The difference is that desire could be controlled, but love could not be. That is why there is an eloquent mortal saying, "It is impossible to know where love starts nor where it goes." With Dong Hua, it wasn't the controllable desire but rather the uncontrollable love. She thought she had cut her feelings off, but she didn't expect those roots to be buried so deep. At first, she thought she had cut them all cleanly, but the more she dug, the more she found. She thought the past had been swept away with the wind, and everything had turned to a cloud of dust. But with Dong Hua's simple words, the layer of dirt was lifted and she was made to realize just how deeply and securely her feelings were rooted. Why did Yan Chaiwu trap Dong Hua again? Why had she not learned her lesson and still come here to save him like a lunatic? She didn't cared about these questions any longer. Didn't Daijun say she always came to save him when he was trapped? After 200 years, it seemed, he finally found out she was the little fox who saved him from the wicked lotus sphere that year, his little fox who once stayed next to him on Zhukongtian. Did he also know she suffered so much only for him? But what if he knew and what if he didn't? This wasn't the time for such questions. Tears suddenly welled up and rolled down from her eyes. She heard her own hoarse voice, "So you do know I was the fox back then. But why did you only find out now?" The atmosphere inside the bed curtain suddenly sank heavily. Dong Hua wiped the tears on the corners of her eyes and said after a long silence, "Everything was my fault." She stared at Dong Hua with misty eyes. She never saw this expression on his face before. She knew, he was yielding to her. He yielded to her that he was wrong, but she knew too that one wasn't at fault if one didn't know. It wasn't Dong Hua's fault, it was heaven who did not grant them this fate. It was unfair to Dong Hua that he had to apologize. It would be unreasonable if she were to hysterically question him right now. She only heard a smile can melt away a feud. She never heard one should use tears to make new enemies. She raised her hand to wipe her tears, then dropped her gaze and whispered, "It's okay. Before Jihan came to Taichan Palace, you had treated me very well. Only after she came did you start to treat me poorly. But you don't have to worry about this because I have long thought carefully about it. Jihan is the one you love. I was only a pet in Taichan Palace. Since I scratched Jihan, it wasn't wrong for you to punish me. It was fine too that you didn't come to visit me when I was locked up, because you were busy with your wedding preparations with Jihan. There are many things to worry about in a wedding, there were many etiquettes to attend to. It was understandable that you would forget about me." She sniffled and tried to appear generous. "You don't have to worry about the time the snow lion almost killed me either. I've already thought it through. On that day, had I listened to Zonglin and stayed put, I wouldn't get into the troubles I encountered. I can't really blame anyone, after all. I can only blame my own bad luck." She raised her hands to wipe away her tears and sincerely said, "Since I suffered many hardships when I was at your palace, heaven might be telling me that you and I aren't fated, that's why I..." Daijun's voice asked her from above, "That's why you..." Fengju raised her head in silence. Undried tears rolled down her chin when Daijun distracted her with his question of "That's why you..." She wasn't sure herself. Daijun knitted his brow, his face suddenly became ice cold. Fengju felt Dong Hua's eyes had seemed sad when he looked at her. Back then on Zhukongtian, had he known his pet fox was the young queen of the Bai family in King Kaiu, what would he have done? Dong Hua thought about this and felt more likely than not he would return Fengju back to King Kaiu. If the baby fox had saved him in the wicked lotus sphere, then he would gift her with some heavenly treasures as a show of gratitude. He undeniably adored her, but it wasn't exactly convenient to keep the queen of an entire clan to raise as a pet. There were many things that had happened to her that he did not know, and perhaps this ignorance was also a mistake in itself, yet he could not change what had already passed. Regret would not help anything. Fengju's face was showing fatigue, her eyes vaguely gazing to the moon hanging atop a branch. She had been awake for nearly half an hour. Time was running out. Fengju's cultivation was depleted when she fell into Aranya's dream. Both her soul and body were injured. Throughout these 3 months, she had had to rely on Donghua's blood 3 times a day to mend her soul and restore her 30,000 years of energy. But her body was still very weak, and she needed more time to recover. Fairies usually look for places where dense mystical energy congregated to nurse their body back to health. But there was little mystical energy inside Fanyan Valley. There weren't too many sacred places here either. Donghua used his own energy to create an enchantment field especially designed for Fengju's recuperation. According to the rules of enchantment field sorcery, since it was created specifically for Fengju, when she woke up, dormant energy around her body would start to rise, the enchantment field would also spontaneously take effect, and her body would be encased in it for an hour. This was why he said time was running out. However, although the enchantment was a good place to nurse an immortal body, it wasn't somewhere a soul should stay inside for too long. It was best to place her elsewhere. In a case such as Fengju's current condition, it was best to keep her soul in a living person where she could have access to continuous life force. As for Aranya's dream, there was no rush to leave yet. Fengju leaned against the bed frame as she gazed vaguely to the quilt on her body. Donghua wordlessly knitted his brow. He knew Xiao Bai must hate him right now. Truthfully, it wasn't unreasonable for her to hate him. But her healing enchantment seal would only last half an hour more. Once she entered into the enchantment seal, with how weakened her body had become, she'd need at least 3 more months before she could leave. To spend this last half hour with her while she hated him would be a big waste. Inside the soft curtain, the atmosphere momentarily became muted. Outside were sounds of the cicadas. In the bed corner, Fengju held onto the quilt and hesitatingly looked at Donghua. "What's wrong, Daijun?" Daijun recovered, looked at her thoughtfully for a long while and at length replied, "You were about to say, that was why." When he saw that she was beginning to frown in thought, he suddenly said, "There's no that was why. The truth is that we've already wedded." Boom! Fengju hit her head on the bed frame. "How could that be?" she asked in shock. Sorrow cast in Daijun's eyes. "Why not?" he asked her. Fengju rubbed her temple and said, "I don't remember." She didn't remember at all that she and Donghua had exchanged their birth dates, had performed nuptial rites, or had consummated their marriage. Of course, it was fine to not remember one thing, but she hadn't the slightest memory of even half a detail. Quite possibly Daijun was trying to fool her. But his face at this moment was so sincere, she stared in befuddlement at him. Donghua helped rub the bump on her forehead to get rid of the bruise and said, "You don't remember because you've lost your memory. I had lied to you when I said you were drowsy from your sleep." He had the patience to add, "I was worried you'd be frightened if you knew. The truth is, you have amnesia." Amnesia? Amnesia. As an immortal living in a dangerous era where it was extremely popular to get amnesia either by potions or spells, getting amnesia was indeed quite easy. Fengju stammered, Am I that unlucky?" Inside her head were indeed many, many things she could not think of. Verifying this against what had happened earlier, she increasingly felt Daijun's words might really be true. She panicked, but clearly, how could I have agreed to this marriage? Daijun's hand paused, his eyes bore into hers as his words struck deep. Because, Xiaobai, don't you like me? The tender look on Daijun's face right this second couldn't have been deadlier. Fengju's heart skipped a beat as she desperately resisted a pandemic demise. It was definitely not for this reason. If this was the reason, then all those things I did. With an unchanging expression, Daijun corrected his words, this is only one of them. He added, it was mainly because I had knelt down to ask for your forgiveness. Fengju wasn't desperate anymore. Fengju was blown away. Fengju, who was blown away, quietly placed her fist into her mouth. Daijun's aura when he knelt down, moreover his aura when he knelt down to her, she tried her best to conjure up the image but found it impossible to imagine. Something so incredible she couldn't even imagine. Something so rare it didn't happen for thousands of years. But she had forgotten it all. What a crying shame! Daijun said he had knelt down to her to propose. Putting aside the frightening tale that the eminent king had actually knelt down, more importantly, why did Daijun want to marry her? This was truly a mystery for the ages. Her curiosity grew over her shock and she tentatively blurted, "You're forced to marry me because you feel guilty, right? Then what of your beloved Jihan?" Daijun was stunned for a moment. He replied in puzzlement, "Jihan and I, how can you think of such a thing? Our ages are too different." He saw her watery dark eyes as comprehension suddenly dawned on him that their age difference was even larger. A frown passed over his face as he told her succinctly, "Jihan and I have nothing to do with each other." Fengju was shocked to hear this directly from Dong Hua. She was so shocked, she began to mutter to herself, "Truthfully, am I still dreaming right now?" She pinched herself. From her eyes instantaneously rolled down 2 tears. With misty eyes, she said, "Oh, so I'm not dreaming, I really have amnesia and forgot too many things. I feel this world has changed to where I can no longer recognize some of it." She looked to Dong Hua in bewilderment. "I actually have one more question. I don't know whether I can ask you or not." This question would be a bit hurtful, but since she was really curious, she didn't have the patience to wait for Dong Hua to nod and spoke up before him, "If we're married like you said, I'm still somewhat puzzled as to why my old man would agree to this marriage, because you..." She had a slight difficulty telling him this, "because my old man is an extremely traditional immortal. You are not from an established family, neither do you have any power. You don't satisfy his criteria as a son-in-law candidate." Daijun was silent for a moment. So King Kaihu had such rules for selecting son-in-laws. "I didn't know about this." He gave some thought, then sincerely said, "Perhaps Bai Yi did not feel I have a glorious future, but since I knelt to you, I won him over with my honesty and honor, so he took pity on me and agreed." Listening to the story wafting out from Daijun's mouth, Fengju wondered if perhaps it had sounded a little fishy. But she couldn't quite put a finger on what was strange about it. If they were speaking of reasons, his reason was perfectly legitimate. People from King Kaihu had always been known to be soft-hearted and easily flooded with compassion. Then in retrospect, Daijun had not lied to her. She and Daijun had really wedded. She didn't know why she had reconciled with herself and agreed to marry Daijun. Nonetheless, Daijun must have spent some effort to disentangle the tangles in her mind. It must not have been easy on Daijun. It turned out she and Daijun had finally reached such an ending. Divine will was indeed impossible to foresee. When you thought it was this, it turned out to be that. And yet, this was a kind of pleasure for immortals who lived forever long. Because heaven was difficult to predict, she became wistful for a moment. When she woke from her trance, she saw Daijun's dark eyes pausing on her. She didn't know why, but happiness started to fill her heart. She pretended to cough loudly in an attempt to desperately repress her exuberant mood. Then she tentatively turned to Donghua and said, "Daijun, are you certain you only knelt down to me? Although I don't remember anything, are you certain you haven't done other embarrassing things?" In her mind, despite using two non-pressing rhetorical questions, she had voiced her doubts in each of those sentences. If something is suspicious, it can't be absolutely true. Upon hearing her remark, Daijun suddenly turned quiet. This was a prime example. She was definitely smart to have known this all on her own. She restrained her surging feelings of self-admiration and said with a sense of satisfaction, "Don't try to trick me just because I can't remember. I changed my mind just because you knelt down to me. Don't underestimate me. I don't believe you." She added the last line originally so that she could hear a few soothing words from Donghua's mouth. But for some reason, Daijun was caught in a long period of rumination after listening to her until a falling dry branch dropped onto the bed curtain to break the silence. His mind snapped back as he softly replied, "If I want you to believe me," he slightly pondered, "what must I do, Xiao Bai?" Fengju believed it was a display of his shyness that Daijun had not answered her questions but turned the conversation around instead. Also, he had had to redeem himself by doing so many outrageous things that he could not bear to recall those memories. She was very pleased. However, she still didn't fully understand why Daijun wanted to redeem himself. But didn't she already forget the reason? She had forgotten too many things that she couldn't expect to comprehend everything in a second or two. Daijun was still knitting his brow. He seemed pensive as he asked her, "What do you want me to do, Xiao Bai?" Because she firmly believed Donghua was being shy at this moment, she was inwardly happy. She felt that she shouldn't force Daijun to feel even worse. If Daijun had used this trick to change the subject, she should play along. She scratched her head and slowly replied, "What should you do? I can't really think of what I'd want you to do either." A pause, then, "However, I heard if one wants to prove his love, one usually carves his heart out as proof." "Oh, you probably haven't heard of this. From what my aunt says, it's a popular thing in the mortal realm. When one wants to declare his feelings, there is nothing more sincere than carving his heart out. Mortals die when their hearts are removed, so when death is made into remembrance, such memory cannot fail to be significant nor can it fail to be sincere." Seeing Daijun's frowning face, she coughed and said, "That is, I'm only saying this because you asked what I wanted you to do." I thought of what to say but nothing came to mind. She scratched her head and added, "Right now I can't think of a single thing that I really want you to do." Her eyes slightly gazed toward the corner of the curtains as she blinked her eyes. "If there's some incense in the furnace right now, I might be able to sleep a little better. You can help me light the incense burner now. When I think of something, I'll tell you again in the future. Since we are husband and wife, let's not dwell on this." When the words husband and wife left her mouth, a flash flickered in her eyes and she embarrassingly looked away. There was a taste of novelty as these two words lingered on her lips. It wasn't as if she had never married before. But her marriage to Qingti in the mortal realm was due to circumstances, it was only in name. He had never called her his wife, she had never referred to herself as such either. It turned out a marriage of mutual love was actually like this. Thoughtfulness dwelt within Dong Hua's eyes, but there remained nothing strange in his voice. At length, he said, "All right, let me owe you for now and ask me later." He turned and lit the incense burner for her. They were indeed married. Daijun agreed to everything she said today. Red rain falling from the sky could not be odder. Daijun sat on the edge of the bed with his back turned against her. He conjured up a three-legged bronze incense burner from his fingers, then took some pieces of fire stones from his sleeve. His actions were swift and smooth. Fengju took time to recall Daijun's expressions today. Although it was mostly her opinion, it seemed there were some subtle differences, and these subtle differences were a little difficult to understand. She couldn't understand, so she didn't plan to understand. Instead, she knelt closer to him, wanting to see what kind of incense he was burning. Without warning, the purple back suddenly turned around, taking her by surprise. Daijun's face was only inches away from hers. With this close distance to Daijun came the sight of his icy lips. She held on to her composure. "I wanted to see what kind of incense you're burning." Because she was kneeling on her knees, she was sitting at a higher elevation than Daijun, subjugating Daijun into a rare lower position. She quietly straightened up to get away from his face. But halfway, her left shoulder was held in place by Daijun's hand and she was slightly pulled toward him. Her leaning position appeared as though she was intending to do something to Daijun. His head was slightly raised. "You seem to be thinking about something." When Daijun asked aloud this question, she was not thinking of anything. But because Daijun so asked, she remembered something. Pop! A burst of flame blazed from her head down to her neck. Because they were too close, Daijun's breath unexpectedly schemed over her lips when he spoke. He asked again, "What are you thinking?" Seeing Daijun's handsome face up close, Fengju suddenly had a grand realization. In a drifting immortal life lasting a perpetual span, indefinite and without end, it had seemed at first glance one could enjoy anything and everything. But in reality, it had only seemed that way. Compared to an endless life, if in the realm of impossible hypotheticals, it would be better if she could meet a handsome man she liked just in one lifetime. But this matter of meeting a soul-mate was already rather elusive. On the occasion this elusive chance came along, she should not let that encounter go to waste. Moreover, this impossible hypothetical and elusiveness also happened to be the husband she married. She reached her hands out to cup Daijun's face. In reckless determination, she tried to lean down to him in one fell swoop. At the same time, she immediately felt Daijun's pulling hand, and before she knew it, her head had abruptly lowered down and met his lips. "So you were thinking of this?" There was a hint of laughter in Daijun's voice. She did think of this, but it was one thing for her to think about it, and another for him to say it aloud. She would never admit to such a thing even if she was killed. She put on a temper and righteously said, "Who was thinking of this? I only thought since we are married, on our first time, it certainly wasn't I who took the initiative to kiss you. A moment ago, although it was I who initiated, but that was only because I was dreaming, so I was a little confused. When I'm awake I'm actually a very restrained person." Daijun interrupted her and said, "You're absolutely right. It was I who took the initiative." She wanted to say more, but her unspoken words were swallowed up by a kiss. Daijun had his eyes closed, and she found out his lashes were very long. In the background, the white forest was illuminated to view by the night pearl above the bed canopy. Fengju wrapped her arms around Daijun's shoulder, slightly bent her head, also closed her eyes, and slowly encircled Daijun's neck. Each of her movements was done in unconsciousness. In her mind, she vaguely felt marriage was indeed a mystical thing. Even in her wildest imagination, never did she think there'd be one day when he would be her husband or that he'd kiss her like this. His hand was gently placed on her nape, his eyes were defenselessly closed, and he ever so gently bit into her lips. Daijun was perhaps the divinest out of all divines, forever staying inside the three purities of the untroubled Bodhi land. There was no one in the world who dared to entice him into the dusty realm, but she had the audacity to try such a thing. She tried, and it worked. She was too talented. She drew him into this love affair, something he had never experienced before. He must not be used to it. But even so, he was not lost. He was still going at his pace, by his rules. He was certainly the king she always knew. She loved it. A while later, Dong Hua bent down to watch Fengju sleeping in his arms. The girl he was holding had a pair of slender brows, thick still lashes, and plump rosy lips. Compared to when she had just woken up, her expression seemed to be improving. An hour was too short. Although he had used a dishonorable method to prevent her from quarreling with him, he didn't really care whether it was right or not. As far as he was concerned, if it was useful, it was good. The most important thing at this time was extracting her soul so her body could immediately recuperate inside the healing enchantment seal. He must not miss the hour. After several months, by the time her body was healed and she could leave the enchantment seal, would her muddled memory be restored? Would she hate him when she recalled this period? Of course Daijun had thought of this, and it was causing him a slight headache. But unlike warfare strategies where countermeasures could be arranged in advance, he could only improvise when the time came. Once he saw her reactions, he would know how to coax her again. He carried a soundly asleep Fengju to the marsh. The moonlight was quiet and cold. Daijun held Fengju in one arm. He waved his other as the submerged healing enchantment seal under the Shuiyu marsh broke free from the water surface. The water curtain parted on either side of the seal and revealed an ice coffin enveloped in glowing white light. The puffs of mist surrounding the ice coffin instantaneously glided across the water. It was apparent at once that this spreading mist was boundless fairy essence. Although it was dim within the mist, the moon's pure light was completely different from the forest's emerald brilliance, instantly eclipsing the entire perimeter of the white forest in its luminance. The fish swimming underwater was blessed with some fairy essence that equaled over a century of cultivation. They raced each other to shapeshift, rushing to prostrate by the marsh to the purple-robed deity. Daijun paid little attention to them and trod into the water. He carefully transferred the sleeping Fengju from his embrace into the ice coffin. He heard her frown in her sleep, cold. There was a bold fish who craned its neck wanting to see how the girl inside the coffin looked. His friends hurriedly pulled him back and pushed his head down. The little fish behaved himself, this time raising its eyes to sneak a peek. Daijun removed his outer robe and draped it over Fengju. He held her hands tightly until she stopped shivering, then whispered soothingly, "Be good and wait here a while. I'll come back for you after some time." He then smoothed her stray hair and turned to say to the kneeling fish sprites, "I'll leave her here with you. Help me look after her." He did not raise his voice, but the group of fish sprites in the marsh dropped their heads even lower, in a deferential, almost pious way. Their voices sounded cowardly but also disciplined. "Your Grace's wish is our command." The circular moon disappeared behind the clouds. The group of fish sprites saw the white-robed deity watch the maiden inside the coffin for a long while, then placed his finger on her forehead and brought her soul out. Like a white stream of mist, the extracted soul softly winded around his finger, giving off a faint glow, dignified and beautiful. Fengju's soul needed to be stored inside a living person to recuperate. But if her soul was transplanted into a normal person while her cultivation was limited, he feared her soul would entangle with the host's soul and afterwards become inseparable. That would be very problematic. It was better to find a pregnant woman to host her soul inside the womb, that would be the best. Dong Hua carefully gathered Fengju's soul and turned around. Behind him, the ice coffin slowly immersed into the water. Tonight was windless. It was a good day. End of chapter 2.